Sometimes, man, if it were only sometimes this government didn't work. Okay, here we go. So I gotta start with a story. I was told all stories start like this. Once upon a time, there was a place called Lesterland. It's a secret, nobody knows this. My first name's Lester, so I'm allowed to make fun of Lesters. I'm gonna make fun of Lesters here and tell you a little bit about Lesterland. Now, Lesterland looks a lot like the United States. Like the United States, it has about 311 million people, and of the 311 million people, 144,000 happen to be named Lester. So that means about 0.05% of Lesterland is named Lester. Okay, now, Lesters in Lesterland have an interesting sort of power. There are two elections every election cycle in Lesterland. One of them is called a general election. The other is called a Lester election. Okay? In the general election, all citizens get to vote if you're 18 or over, some states if you have an ID. In the Lester election, the Lesters get to vote. But here's the catch. To be allowed to run in the general election, you must do extremely well in the Lester election. You don't necessarily have to win, but you must do extremely well. So we have a democracy in Lesterland, but what can we say about that democracy? Well, we can say, number one, as the Supreme Court said in the case of Citizens United, that the people have the ultimate influence over the elected officials. Because after all, there is a general election. But only after the Lesters have had their way with the candidates who wish to run in that general election. And number two, obviously, this dependence upon the Lesters is going to produce a subtle, understated, maybe camouflaged bending to keep the Lesters happy. So, it's a democracy, one dependent upon the Lesters and dependent upon the people, competing dependencies, maybe conflicting dependencies, depending upon who the Lesters are. Okay, that's Lesterland. Now, there are three things I want you to recognize now that you've seen Lesterland. Number one, the United States is Lesterland. The United States is Lesterland. The United States also looks like this, also has two elections. One election we could call the general election. The other election we should call the money election. In the general election, it's the citizens who get to vote if you're 18 or over, in some states if you have an ID. In the money election, it's the relevant funders who get to vote. And just as in Lesterland, to be allowed to run in the general election, you must do extremely well in the money election. You don't necessarily have to win, but you must do extremely well. And here's the key that links America to Lesterland. There are just as few relevant funders in USA land as there are Lesters in Lesterland. Now you say, really? Really? 0.05%? Here are the numbers from 2010. 0.26% of America. You know, you're thinking, he's a lawyer, doesn't know how to do fractions, but I really mean 1/4% of America gave $200 or more to any candidate running for federal office. 0.05% gave the maximum amount allowed to give to any candidate running for federal office. 0.01%, the 1% of the 1%, gave $10,000 or more. And my favorite number from this election cycle is 0.2000042%, for the math whizzes, you know that's 132 Americans, gave 60% of the super PAC money that was spent in the election cycle that just ended. So I look at this and I say, okay, 0.26, 0.05, 0.01, I think it's completely fair for me to say, at the most, 0.05% of Americans are the relevant funders of America's elections. In this sense, the funders are our Lesters. Now, what can we say about democracy in USA land then? Well, number one, we can say, as the Supreme Court said in Citizens United, the people have the ultimate influence over the elected officials. Of course, because there is a general election. But only after the funders have had their way with the candidates who wish to run in that general election. And number two, obviously, this dependence upon the funders produces a subtle, understated, we could say camouflaged bending to keep those funders happy. Members of Congress and candidates for Congress spend anywhere between 30 and 70% of their time raising money to get back to Congress or to get their party back to power. And the thing we have to focus on is, what does it do to them? to spend their life dialing for dollars, calling the tiniest fraction of the 1%, begging them for the money they need to run their elections. As any of us would, they develop a sixth sense, a constant awareness about how what they do will affect their ability to raise money. They become, in the words of the X-Files, shapeshifters, as they constantly adjust their views in light of what they know will help them to raise money, not on issues 1 to 10, but on issues 11 to 1,000. Leslie Byrne, a Democrat from Virginia, describes that when she went to Congress, she was told by a colleague, quote, "Always lean to the green." Then to clarify, she went on, he was not an environmentalist. So here, too, there's a democracy, one dependent upon the funders and dependent upon the people, competing dependencies, conflicting dependencies, depending upon who the funders are. Okay. That's the first point. The United States is Lesterland. Here's the second point. The United States is worse than Lesterland. Worse than Lesterland. Because in Lesterland, if we Lesters got a letter from the government telling us that we got to pick who the candidates in the general election would be. There are Lesters from all parts of societies. Black Lesters, white Lesters, rich Lesters, poor Lesters. Not many women Lesters, but put that aside for a second. But there are all sorts of Lesters. We can imagine the development of a kind of aristocracy of us Lesters. It's at least possible. We would think we need to act for the betterment of Lesterland. It's at least possible. That's the way we would arrange our votes to make the best possible candidates for the general elections. But in our land, in this land, in USA land, though there are some sweet Lesters out there, the vast majority of the Lesters here act for the Lesters. Because the shifting coalitions of people who comprise the 0.05% don't gather together to advance the public interest. It's their own private interest that controls them and therefore controls our government. The United States is worse than Lesterland. And then finally, point number 3. Whatever one wants to say about Lesterland against the background of its traditions, its theory, its principles, in our land, in USA land, Lesterland is a quote-unquote corruption. Corruption. Now, by corruption, I don't mean cash secreted in brown paper bags by members of Congress, bribing them to commit illegal acts. I don't mean kind of Chicago-ish, Rob Blagojevich sense of corruption. Nothing I'm talking about is criminal or illegal. Everything I'm talking about is perfectly legal. But even though it's legal, it is corruption relative to our framers' baseline of the government they meant to create. The framers gave us what they called a republic. But by a republic, they meant a representative democracy. And by a representative democracy, as Federalist 52 puts it, James Madison's words, what they meant was a government that would have a branch that would be, quote, dependent upon the people alone. So here's the model of government. They have the people, they have the government. I do my own slides. It's cool the way that bounces like that, right? Okay. The people and the government. But here's the problem. Congress has evolved a different dependence. No longer a dependence upon the people alone, increasingly a dependence upon the funders. This is a dependence too. But it's a dependence that is different and conflicting from a dependence upon the people alone, so long as the funders are not the people. A corruption. Now, there's good news and bad news about this corruption. The good news is it's bipartisan equal opportunity corruption. It blocks the left on a whole bunch of things the left wants to do if the left ever gets back into power in our government. It blocks the right too. The right says it wants smaller government. When Al Gore was vice president, he had an idea, a plan to deregulate a significant portion of the telecommunications industry. His chief lobbyist took that idea to Capitol Hill, and the report he got back from Capitol Hill was, hell no. If we deregulate these guys, how are we going to raise money from them? For people who want a smaller government, you need to recognize there's a thumb on the scale of bigger government because bigger government makes it easier for candidates and members of Congress to raise money. This is a system driven to saving the status quo. It works against the objectives of the left and right. And you could say, fair then, it's good that it's fair at least. But the problem, the bad news here is, this is a pathological democracy destroying corruption. Because in any system where such a tiny, tiny fraction of the public has the power to block change. What that means is the tiniest number, and I mean the tiniest possible number of people, have the capacity to block reform. I know, it should have been a rock or something. I could only find cheese. Okay, but block reform. Because in Washington, in K Street, there's an ecology here. An ecology with lobbyists at the center. Lobbyists paid by the Lesters who are keen to leverage their power over candidates running for Congress to get for the Lesters the returns the Lesters want. It feeds this system on polarization. It feeds on dysfunction. The worse it is for us, the better it is for their fundraising. Okay, now, if you look at this, you say, how would you fix it? What would you do? The analytics here are pretty easy. If the problem is we have members of Congress spending too much time raising money from too small a slice of America, the solution is a solution where they spend less time raising money, but from a wider slice of America, to spread out the funders' influence to ideally get to the world of all of us funding campaigns so that they're dependent on all of us alone. And to do this, we don't need, as a first step to amend the Constitution, a single statute which would change the way we fund elections, moving us from big dollar-funded elections to small dollar-funded elections would work. And there are any number of examples out there right now being proposed, from matching fund proposals to tax credit proposals to an idea I advance in my book of vouchers, where everyone gets a voucher to help fund campaigns. John Sarbanes, a Democrat from Maryland, has an idea to wrap all three vouchers, tax credits, and matching grants into one single grassroots democracy act. The point is, each of these would fix this radically corrupt system we have right now, where the top 1% in America per capita has 10 times the influence of the bottom 99% combined. The analytics are easy. It's the politics that's hard. And maybe impossibly hard. Because the reform we need would shrink the power of K Street, where the lobbyists work. And Capitol Hill has become, as Congressman Jim Cooper, a Democrat from Tennessee who first went to Congress in 1983, describes it, Capitol Hill has become a, quote, farm league for K Street. Members and staffers and bureaucrats have this increasingly common business model, a business model focused on their life after government, their life as lobbyists. Between 1998 and 2004, 50% of the Senate left to become lobbyists, 42% of the House. And as United Republic calculated last year, the average salary increase for those members they tracked going from Capitol Hill to K Street was 1,452%. So in a world where these people depend, everyone within the Beltway depends upon this system surviving, it's completely fair to ask, how is it possible to imagine them changing this? Now, I get this skepticism. I get the pessimism. I get the sense that we just can't do anything about this, but I don't buy it. This problem is solvable. Indeed, if you think about the problems our parents and grandparents took on in the 20th century, the problems of racism, the problems of sex equality, and the problem that still continues to be addressed this century, the problem of homophobia, those were hard problems. You don't wake up one day and just rip the DNA of discrimination out of a society. It takes generations to work that out so that the society can return or become healthy. But the problem I'm talking about is a problem of just incentives. Just change the incentives and the behavior changes. And the states that have experimented with small dollar-funded elections have found the character of their legislatures has changed overnight. Connecticut, when it adopted this system, in its first year, having members take small contributions only, found 78% of the elected representatives opted into a system where they took no big money in their campaigns. This is a solvable problem. But I flew out here today, waking at 3 in the morning to see your bright faces, because in my view, it is only solvable by you. Because here's the top secret. that we old people keep and we never tell you. And I'm about to get into a lot of trouble because I'm going to tell you. The top secret is, the problem I'm describing here, we did this to you. We old people, we're not that person in particular, more likely that person, we did this to you. They, the politicians, we did this to you. We ruined the government we inherited from our parents. We did that and we did it to you. And it will only be fixed by you. It will only be fixed by you. Now, how can you take on this power? Well, the first thing is you need to talk about it and think about it, not in a partisan way. This is a cross-partisan movement. It takes a cross-partisan movement. It's not the Democratic Party, it's not the Republican Party that's going to solve this. It's a party of citizens, ordinary citizens, who are fed up and tired of watching them play the games that they play and destroy this government. That's it, number one. Cross-partisan citizens movement. And number two, it's not a top-down solution. This requires a bottom-up grassroots movement. And if you make it common wisdom that this is the change we need, it makes it possible for them, the politicians, to begin to talk back and say, fine, I'll take up your cause. I will bring this change about. So it takes a practice of show and tell. You remember, second grade, show and tell. Here it is, show and tell. So first, show. You need this practice, this life, of trying to see how every single issue that is confronting our country, you need to show, you need to think about how every one of these issues is tied to the money. Ron and I just began our conversation about how the issue he was talking about, the way food is not food in America, is tied to the money. It's tied to the money. Millions and millions of campaign contributions to guarantee that the worst food is the food that's produced in the biggest bulk and shipped to you and forced into your schools. My wife tries to get exactly the kind of food Ron's talking about into schools. There's a federal policy against healthy foods coming into your school. The only foods that come into your school are foods provided by dairy producers who get their support and guarantee and protection from laws passed in Washington. You need to see how every issue you care about ties to the money. You need to think about it. You need to become aware. You need to educate yourself about the intelligence, the gangster of intelligence, to see that as the first step. And then you need to tell others. You need to spread that understanding. Spread it on every platform you know. Spread it in a way that begins to teach people and show them how this problem is at the root. I started an organization called Rootstrikers. I was on The Daily Show. Jon Stewart said, it's a terrible name. You got to call it Batman. Batman. All right. Well, Batman or Rootstrikers, you tell me. But here's the inspiration to Rootstrikers. Henry David Thoreau wrote, for every 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil, there is one striking at the root. The root. The root is this corruption. And what we need to do is to recruit the one out of every 1,000 to begin to talk about this root of corruption and to find a way to strike back at it. And you can do that. You can do that first by joining in this project at this site, rootstrikers.org. You can do it, number two, without even joining. You can tell every time you see a story that you think is tied to the money, you tweet it with this hashtag, Rootstrikers. But most importantly, you begin to remix this story into your own words. This movement doesn't need a Malcolm X or a Martin Luther King. This movement needs 100,000 Malcolm X's and Martin Luther Kings. It needs everybody to find a way to turn this into a story that everybody can understand. And this is the Remix Project. Every one of you received a little thumb drive. And on that thumb drive is a ton of source material. This talk, the slides for this talk, the material backing up the slides for this talk, links to other material as source, licensed freely for you to take and to begin to make your own story, to tell your own story in 1 to 2 to 5 to 10 to an hour-long presentations in a way that makes it so others can understand it and do something with it. And find the story most compelling to you. So I fly to Chicago this morning, reminded of this event in Connecticut, reading a statistic on the airplane this morning that last year 440 children were the victims of gun violence in this city last year. 440 children. And then I think back to just a couple weeks ago when the Senate blocked the most pissy-ant gun control legislation you could ever imagine. Blocked. Even though 83% of Americans supported it. 83% of Americans supported it. So why? Why was that? Why was that? It was the money. It was the money, stupid, the money. And until we can get America to recognize where every single important issue we care about, it's the same thing. It's the money, stupid. We will never get a government back again that can do anything we care about. Because you need a government that works. We blew it, but only works if we end this corruption. When Ben Franklin was carried from the Constitutional Convention in 1787, he was stopped on the streets of Philadelphia by a woman who said, "Mr. Franklin, what have you wrought?" Franklin said, "A republic, madam, if you can keep it. A republic, a representative democracy, a government dependent upon the people alone." We have lost that republic. It is not what we give you. But all of us, and you in particular now, need to act to get it back. Thank you very much.